In these videos, I'm basically telling the story of my experiences during Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines back in 2013. But I'm framing that story within a comparison between that physical disaster and the worldwide pandemic of COVID-19 that we're all experiencing right now. And I'm looking at it mainly from the point of view of the experiences of a foreigner caught in the middle of it while on a trip overseas. In the previous video, part 2, I talked about the moment when the full force of the typhoon hit my hotel and how difficult it was for my brain to adjust and come to terms with how serious the situation really was. In this video, part 3, I'm continuing with that theme by looking at how different the situation appeared depending on your perspective, whether you are looking at it from the outside world on the television news and things like that, compared to how it was, from my point of view, being right there physically in the middle of it. I end up talking about quite a few things in this video. I talk about storm chasers, I talk about the physical reality of post-typhoon life, I talk about the sad necessity and challenge of body collection in a disaster, I talk about panic and misinformation, and I talk about a big decision that everyone has to make in a disaster. Should I stay, or should I try to get out? Another big similarity between like a typhoon disaster and COVID-19 is that it looks very different depending on where you are in the world, depending on your point of view and your sources of information. So with everything that I know now, because I know so much about Typhoon Yolanda and what happened, I can look back and kind of shake my head at me. It's like, what a dummy, you know? But at that time, I didn't know any of these things. Other people did, but me, the weird thing is I was right in the heart of it. I was in the center of the city that was destroyed by the typhoon. I was right there, and I knew less about what was going on than you did, perhaps, if you were somewhere else in the world watching the news about this typhoon and what was going on in the Philippines. To be honest, when I was there in Tacloban after the typhoon hit, I thought the world had pretty much forgotten about us. I mean, we were completely cut off from the world. And I was much more cut off then than I am now, because this was 2013. I hadn't gone digital yet. I didn't have a smartphone. I'd never had a smartphone. I didn't have a tablet. I'd never had a tablet. I wasn't traveling with a laptop, so I had no laptop. You know, so no hard drive. I had nothing. You know, I had no real technology. So I didn't know anything about what was going on. Like, even if there was still internet, even if there were still phone connections, which there weren't because all the cell phone towers had been destroyed as well. They'd all been knocked down. So I basically only knew what was within the 20 feet around me. And other people knew so much more. I came across so many interesting stories, again, things that were happening and I had no clue they were happening. For example, there were storm chasers. I found this out much later, after I left Tacloban and I was in Cebu City and I could get on the internet and look up all these stories. There were these storm chasers, and of course they make their living by getting ahead of storms, setting up cameras, and they take video of the storm and then they sell that footage to news organizations later on. You know, that's how they make their living. They do it for fun, I think, and for adventure, but also they can make money doing this. So there's this story of this group of storm chasers who are following the news, and I watched their documentary afterwards, and wherever they were in the world, they could see what was coming, much more than I could. It's like big news articles, Category 5 typhoon, super typhoon, Typhoon Haiyan, making landfall at Tacloban, strongest storm in history. You know, the Philippines is bracing for disaster, on and on and on. They saw all this information, and while they were absorbing that, I was in Tacloban, just la 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 la, you know, just walking around. And I actually met some people that day who became so important in my life. They're just absolute chance encounter. But I dropped by this local store, and I met the family running this store, and the patriarch of the family, the man. He had spent a lot of years in the United States. You know, he'd lived there and had businesses there, and then he moved back to the Philippines and had kind of a set of businesses in Tacloban. And meeting this family saved my life, and I met them just by chance that day. So that's what I was doing in Tacloban that day. You know, I went to immigration, la 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 la, oh, typhoon coming, okay, I'll stay another day, la la la. I meet these people at this business. I sit down with them, have a drink, have a cup of coffee, we're chatting. I go back to my hotel, you know, I go to sleep. Just, you know, you could not get dumber. Meanwhile, these guys on the other side of the world were seeing good information about this tremendously powerful storm bearing down on me, and I had no idea what was coming, but they did. And they arranged as fast as they could to get on a flight. They flew to the Philippines. Maybe they were in the Philippines already. I don't remember that part of the story. But they flew to as near to Tacloban as they could get, got a vehicle, probably rented a vehicle, and then they drove to the ocean shore just outside Tacloban. And they're setting up their cameras and getting ready for the storm. And there's 2 or 3 of them, and they're having these intense powwows, you know, strategy sessions, and they're monitoring the news like crazy. You know, they still had access to the internet because the storm hadn't hit yet. Me, in my hotel room in Tacloban, I didn't have the internet. I had nothing. I had no computer, as I said, no smartphone, no tablet. So these people, from a totally different point of view, from another country, were much more on top of the situation than I was. So how these disasters look really depends on where you are. And funnily enough, these guys, they were on the coast outside Tacloban. They thought that would be the best place to get video. And then as they were monitoring the news, the typhoon got stronger and stronger and stronger. The predictions got more and more extreme. And they started to freak out a little bit because they're like, okay, this place, we're way too exposed. It's too dangerous, even for storm chasers, to be where they were. And they packed up everything, and they moved to this hotel in Tacloban. And it's one of the nicest, you know, it's a very well-known hotel in Tacloban amongst, you know, the expat community. Very nice place. Quite a few steps above the hotel where I was staying. Mine was quite nice, actually, you know, but theirs was a real hotel. And that's where they settled in to be storm chasers and document the coming typhoon. And of course, their profession was to record this event. So they were very careful about their equipment. They made sure all their batteries were charged, stayed up all night because they wanted to be up and filming the exact second the typhoon hit. And they wanted to record everything from the very beginning. You know, that's their job. Meanwhile, I'm across the city, sound asleep in my bed, dreaming of who knows what. Totally oblivious to, you know, whatever is going on with this typhoon roaring in, while these guys are on a knife's edge of urgency, waiting like soldiers ready to go into action. They got their cameras ready to go. I mean, you could not get a stronger contrast, you know, between our two situations. And this idea of a situation looking completely different depending on your point of view continued, you know, long after the typhoon hit, because Again, if you were following this story, wherever you were in the world, you knew far more than I did. Because I think right from the very beginning, there were helicopters flying over Tacloban, and they were filming the destruction along the coast. And you can see all these before and after images. Here's the image of the city of Tacloban with thousands of houses, and here's what it looks like now. There's nothing there. It's all gone. And of course, in these news stories, they're already talking about the fatality rate. Could be 1,000 dead, and then an hour later, it's maybe 5,000 dead, maybe 10, maybe 15. The relief efforts, emergency declarations, all of this was going on in the international news. Me in Tacloban, no laptop, no smartphone, no tablet, no internet, no electricity, no friends, like no sources of information of any kind, no helicopter in my life. I didn't know. All I knew was what I could see around me. And that first day, my main concern, probably above anything else, was drinking water. Just simple issues of food and water. That was pretty much all I could deal with. I went out into Tacloban. My goal was to go to this store that I mentioned. I met these people, this Filipino family that became kind of my lifeline. And what I wanted to do was walk from my hotel to there, see how they were, and see if their store was still open. Like at this point, I really had no idea what had happened around me. So the flood was still in full force. I go down into the flood, and I'm wading through the water, up to my waist. And again, this leads to an idea about disasters, that there are so many dangers that you wouldn't think of if you hadn't experienced it for yourself. Because this typhoon had destroyed most of the city, debris everywhere, and now the whole landmass was covered in water. You're wading through water up to your waist, and underneath the water there were so many dangers. Like there was houses, whatever was left of houses was just everywhere underwater. Metal, nails poking out of steel. So you just had to be so careful where you were putting your feet. And you'd see people with sticks walking through the water, and they're sort of feeling ahead of them, looking for danger as they're walking through. And I didn't have a stick, but I'm sort of feeling ahead of me, and there was such a real danger of like cutting open your legs, stepping on something sharp, falling into a hole. Yeah, who knows? You don't know what's under the water around you. And again, I learned later on, much, much later, when my world expanded, that at some of the emergency hospitals that other countries had set up near the airport, they were dealing with so many infections because so many local people had bad cuts all over their bodies, either from floating in the water during the storm surge with debris slamming into them and cutting their bodies, or later on just walking around the city and then slipping and falling and then cutting open their legs, and then these cuts get infected. And that was a huge problem that they had to deal with for a long time. So I'm feeling my way through this water, and I got to the corner where I turned down another street, and it was the apocalypse as far as the eye could see. I talked about how cars and trucks float in the water, and there were cars and vehicles everywhere blocking the street, piled up, and debris everywhere. And just to walk down the street, you were mountain climbing up and over vehicles down into the water, then a whole house that had collapsed. You're climbing over the debris of the house, then trying to get over another set of vehicles, And this whole area was quite low, so the flood there stayed for quite a long time. And just walking through there and trying to get out of my neighborhood, my small neighborhood, was a major adventure. That was a big challenge, and that was my world for quite a long time. I got to this store, and I did manage to connect with this family, and I did get drinking water. Their store was in quite a unique position, was a very unique store, and I'll talk about that later on, because most stores had been destroyed, absolutely flooded. All the contents were gone. And the stores that kind of survived, there was a wave of looting that occurred. And so again, those contents were just ripped out of the stores and gone. But this one store, as far as I could tell, was the only one in all of Tacloban that was still fully operational, and they had the most amazing system for dealing with this situation. They're really incredible people. And because I got to know them the day before the typhoon, I got to the front gate of their store, which they had locked. Everything was barricaded so that crowds of people couldn't storm the store and loot it. But then they saw me on the outside of the gate, and then they came out and opened it and let me inside. And then I was able to get food and water and bring it back to my room. And on top of that, I was a little bit prepared, again, because I was on a bike tour, so I had emergency money. The ATMs were all gone, banks were gone, so if you did not have your own money, you're finished. All money was gone, all sources of money were gone. but I happened to have, I don't know, like $1,000 US in cash with me. You know, that was my emergency fund, you know, and I made sure that was safe and dry even throughout this whole experience. You know, I didn't have the clear mind of a Bruce Willis, but I knew enough to keep passport and ID and money safe, so I had that with me. And this family was able to change money for me. You know, they had all these businesses going on, and they had a reserve of, you know, Filipino pesos. So they took US dollars from me, and I got pesos from them. And then I used those pesos to buy a bunch of stuff from their store. So it was kind of a match made in heaven. Anyway, the point I was trying to make there is that in the initial days of this typhoon disaster, I was just trying to survive. You know, I had some very basic needs to take care of, you know, food, water, shelter, money. And that took me to the limit of my abilities. And the world we were living in was a tough one. I mean, the flood and the mud and the destruction. I mean, you couldn't even walk down the street. Just going from one block to the next was, you know, climbing Mount Everest of debris. So your world was pretty small. And my thoughts about the situation conformed to the world that I was seeing around me. So even though I was in the middle of one of the biggest disasters in the history of the Philippines, and even though everyone around the world was aware of what was going on, the level of destruction and how many people had died, I was there and I didn't even know about it. I couldn't tell you exactly what day it was, but there was a very special day where my own world had kind of gotten under control. You know, I woke up in the morning and there was no immediate emergencies to take care of, and my world had expanded a little bit more. And then that was the first time I went far out of my neighborhood, and for the first time I walked to the shore, towards these shanty towns, to the settlements along the ocean where I had spent so much time before. So this is the first time I had gone there, days and days after the worst of the typhoon. And when I got there, I saw what had happened, and that whole part of the city was gone, just flattened. Out of the thousands and thousands of homes, hardly any were left. On both coasts, maybe one or two buildings were still standing, and these were these cement houses that had been built up to 2 or 3 floors. There weren't very many of them, like along the ocean that way. And of course, they had been blown out completely, you know, the doors and the windows, total destruction, but the physical walls, some of them were still standing. And when you look at the media today, photographs of Tacloban, you can actually see some very dramatic shots of these single houses standing in the middle of this, you know, field of destruction. I have a lot of those pictures myself in my photo albums of Tacloban and Typhoon Yolanda. So when I got there and I saw myself what had happened, it came as a complete shock. Up until that point, with no access to the news, without really talking to anyone who knew what was going on, I had no idea that all of that destruction had taken place. And not to get too grim, but this was a big part of my story there, I remember standing on the ocean at one of these community areas, just sort of looking out at this sea of destruction, and I had my camera with me and I was taking pictures of the destruction. Oddly enough, I was using this little Canon point and shoot, you know, a tiny little pocket camera, because, you know, like a dummy, I had not charged the batteries for my real camera, for my Olympus. So all of the pictures I took at the beginning were not taken, you know, with a high quality camera. They were all taken with this little point and shoot. But while I'm standing there looking out over this sea of destruction, I happened to look down and was shocked to see a hand and an arm sticking up from the debris, like right at my feet. I looked down and there was this hand, an arm. I didn't see anything else of the body, just this hand. And, you know, obviously that was a bit of a shock. And then seeing that hand almost was like a filter being taken away or something. It was like I was seeing in a different way. And then now that I was looking out over this area, I hadn't seen them before, but there were bodies everywhere. Just body after body after body, just in the water, floating in the water, half in the water, in the debris piles, sticking half up out of the debris piles, buried in the debris piles, feet sticking out, just bodies just everywhere. And then from that point forward, for the entire time that I was staying in Tacloban, everywhere you went walking, no matter where you went, you came across more and more of these bodies just everywhere. And again, not to get too grim, so one of these situations where if you haven't experienced it for yourself, you probably don't really understand how these things work. I certainly did not. But in the aftermath of a disaster, simply dealing with the scale of bodies that need to be collected and dealt with is a giant and very important task. So that's something you learn very quickly. And you also learn a lot about what happens to the human body, you know, after someone passes away. A lot happens. Again, I had no idea. You know, I live in the world of TVs and movies, and then you see all these shows, police movie where they break into a house and they find a murder victim and they say something like, oh, this body has been here for 3 weeks or something. You know, utter nonsense. After 3 weeks, you know, the human body undergoes a lot of transformations, and to the point where, yeah, it's barely recognizable as a human body. You certainly cannot recognize the person themselves, who they were. You know, there's no facial features left to identify. I mean, I think I'll talk a little bit more about this later. I have some specific stories about this and how my life progressed. But again, that's something you learn about these situations. And I thought of that because it's a little bit similar to COVID-19, because, I mean, hospitals are being overwhelmed with the number of patients. Plus, I think the systems are being overwhelmed with just dealing with the number of bodies that they have to cope with. It's more than normal. And I did see stories, I think, from Ecuador, where in the first stages of the infection and a lot of people dying, they couldn't handle the number of bodies that were being produced. There was nowhere for them to go, and people were just putting bodies at the side of the street and just leaving them there. And that was turning into a problem in Ecuador, according to this article that I read. And that was a huge problem in Tacloban. and the system was largely the same, where the bodies were just lined up at the sides of the roads, all the bodies being carried from the debris fields to the side of the road and then being lined up and then being placed there for collection. And that was simply part of daily life now in this disaster. As I mentioned a couple of times already, I did stay in Tacloban for almost a full 2 months after the typhoon. And just to explain that, there were a number of reasons for that. One, my bicycle was badly damaged, and it took a long time for me to fix the wheels on my bicycle, all the spokes. And actually a local bicycle shop eventually opened, and I got my bike worked on there a little bit. They kind of did more harm than good ultimately. They kind of tore things down, but they never put anything back together properly. But I somehow more or less got the bike rideable again, and that's how I left Tacloban. But before that 2-month period, other things were going on. I was really interested in the rebuilding of Tacloban just personally. I thought it would be kind of fascinating to see the city kind of come back to life after a disaster like that. So the thought of just going to Cebu, like getting out of there as fast as possible, didn't really occur to me, because once the initial shock wore off, where I was quite interesting. And then Cebu is just Cebu. It's going to be there later, so I don't have to rush to Cebu. It was interesting to see the rebuilding in Tacloban. Plus, I had nowhere in particular to go. It's not like I had it's similar to my situation here. Back then I didn't have a house or an apartment that I wanted to leave Tacloban and go home. I had no home to go to, just as I have no home to go to now. If I tried really hard to get out of Tacloban and then go to Cebu, when I got to Cebu, I would be staying in a hotel, just as I was doing in Tacloban. And in a weird way, my situation in Tacloban, despite everything, was better, because I had a room. I kind of had food, I kind of had water. That was an ongoing struggle to get those, but I was taking care of that. And I had shelter. I had a hotel room that was mine, all mine, and a hotel that was still standing, and I had a lock on the door that I could lock it, so it was kind of secure for my possessions. And I didn't have to pay for it, because the morning of the day of the typhoon, the owners, the managers, the staff, the family, everybody that ran that hotel, never saw them again. They just vanished. They just disappeared. I don't know what happened to them. I'm sure they had a house in Tacloban and they were living in this house. They didn't live in the hotel. And I'm sure their house was badly damaged, if not destroyed. And I'm sure, being a Filipino family, they had relatives everywhere, and they probably, as soon as they could, got out of Tacloban and went to Cebu, went to Manila, went to wherever, and stayed with relatives in their homes, for the duration of the tragedy of the, typhoon destruction, waiting until the day when they could come back. Whatever happened to them, they were gone. So I basically didn't have to do anything for the whole 2 months. I didn't have to pay for this hotel room. Again, what would you pay? I mean, all the services were gone. No water, no electricity, no staff, no nothing. It was basically a cement shell. It was a room with a door and a lock on it, and that was all. So kind of paying for that would be kind of silly. But at the same time, it was kind of nice that it was free and I didn't have to pay for it. So I didn't have this desperate urge to get out of there. And, despite everything, like I said, the how much it rained and the destruction and the mud and the dirt and the mosquitoes, so many mosquitoes emerged after a while. The city was just overwhelmed with them, to the point that you could barely survive even inside my room. I mean, I could sleep under my mosquito net, but leaving my mosquito net just to go anywhere in my room was like an expedition. You had to plan ahead because you did not want to be out there for any longer than you had to be. You peek out from under that mosquito net and you would just be attacked and bitten from head to toe. It's crazy how many mosquitoes there were. And you heard people talking about mosquito nets. Mosquito nets were also in high demand if anyone could get one, just so you could get some sleep. People couldn't get any sleep because of the torment of all these mosquitoes. And that was mainly because of all the water everywhere that pooled everywhere. And when you look close to these pools of water that were floating, everywhere, the water was black with mosquito larvae. You know how they bob up and down from the bottom to the surface again? These mosquito larvae go up and down, up and down. You look into these pools of water and they were just black with these clouds of mosquito larvae slowly developing and mosquitoes, flying off of these things. Anyway, it was not comfortable, to put it mildly. But, I was in a fairly good situation, like I said, with mosquito net. I could deal with all of this, and there was no tremendous pressure to get out of there. Other people whose homes had been completely destroyed, of course, if they could get out, they would, because whatever shelter they had was now gone. And then, of course, there were the people in the sort of informal settlements. Their homes were destroyed, and they were probably in the worst position because their shelter was gone and they had nowhere else to go to. They couldn't fly to Manila or whatever and just stay in another house. They had to stay where they were. And then, of course, everybody was instantly rebuilding, building whatever home they could build out of the debris field around them. But after all of that, the main reason I didn't go out at the beginning was that the roads were impassable. I mean, you could not get out. I already described my very first walks, climbing over vehicles and debris fields. So you can imagine what it was like trying to move around the city. You just could not get out of it anyway. A big similarity, related to all of that between Typhoon Yolanda and COVID-19 is that when it hits and you're a foreigner overseas or even a local person, everybody has to make a very big, quick decision. Stay or go. In my case, in Tacloban, for all those reasons I outlined, I decided to stay. And that made the most sense to me. Here in Mesot with a COVID-19 lockdown, I'm not trying desperately to get a flight out because the only country I could go to is Canada. And at the moment, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So again, I decided to stay. And in Tacloban, that was a decision a lot of people had to make. I did not know a lot about this at the beginning. In fact, I knew nothing about it. But in Tacloban, there is actually an airport. Here's the city of Tacloban, and then there was a bay, and then a peninsula across the other side. And that's where the airport was. And that whole area had been completely destroyed. When the storm surge hit, it swept over that peninsula and it just flattened it. So all the houses were gone out there as well. I think I have a pretty interesting video clip of what that area looked like. I took this one much later when the roads had cleared up, and I was actually riding in the back of a truck that was out doing rescue work and then collecting dead bodies from all over the place. But I'll stick in that video clip right now, and you can see even what this area over by the airport looked like. And those houses, I believe, were all largely cement structures. And even those were no match for the storm surge. Just, it was like the earth had been scraped clean of everything. All evidence of human habitation, you know, was just gone. So yeah, here's the video clip. I don't know when it happened, but relatively soon, I think, despite that level of destruction, the airport runway was cleared and relief planes started flying in. Again, I knew nothing about this because I had no access to information, but I guess the Filipino government and the Americans were flying C-130 transport planes in and out of Tacloban. They fly in with a relief, you know, food and water and medicine, whatever they're bringing in, and then they would fly out with a load of refugees, essentially, of people trying to get out of Tacloban and go to Cebu and then onwards from there. I didn't know that any of this was going on, but there was one day when a couple of young guys, I think a group of 3 or 4 of them, also staying in my hotel, I was chatting with them, and they said they're going to try to get out the next day, that they were going to walk to the airport and see if they can get on one of these refugee planes and get out of Tacloban. And for them to do that was a major challenge. You know, just walking to the airport, that was going to be a very difficult thing to do. And they prepared for it like an expedition. You know, they planned ahead. They made sure they had food and water, and they're going to leave early in the morning, as early as possible, so they could get to the airport as early as possible, and then try to get on one of these planes. They had no guaranteed seat, of course. They had no idea whether it was going to happen, but this is what they wanted to try to do. So off they went the next morning. I didn't see them when they left. I figured they were now gone. But late in the day, you know, into the evening, they came back and they told me quite a bit about their adventures for the day, told me stories about everything they saw, the level of destruction and the bodies that were everywhere. And then they finally got to the airport, and there was a large crowd of people pressed up against the fence, you know, families carrying bundles of their most important possessions, holding the hands of children. Waiting and waiting and waiting all day in the rain and the hot sun, alternating rain and sun, waiting to get a chance to get onto one of these C-130s. And of course, most of them never did. And these guys that I knew, you know, they waited all day, did everything they could, but they were unable to get on one of these planes. And rather than stay at the airport, they just turned around and made the long walk, you know, all the way back to the hotel. Interestingly, again, connected to this, information plays such a large role. And one of the reasons they wanted to get out so badly was that panic was starting to set in. And I think in all these disasters, COVID-19, typhoons, earthquakes, you really have to be careful about the information source, what you take in. So a lot of it may be just rumor and not true, I'm not sure. But in my hotel, and in my situation, especially in the first week or 2 weeks, there was so much information flying around, rumors, you heard so many stories. And at the very beginning, it was quite dramatic at my hotel, where we could even hear gunfire out in the city from time to time. And stories were going around like wildfire of these roving armed gangs who were going from camp to camp of survivors, holding them up, stealing everything they had. And all the people in the hotel, whenever they talked to me, would fill my head with horror stories of what was going to happen to me. And they had so much advice for me and things I should do. So they basically said, at some point, an armed gang, post-apocalyptic roving gang is going to burst through these gates. They're going to hold us all up at gunpoint, and they're going to steal everything we have. So as soon as you can, what you better do is get all your valuables, get your money and passport, anything you really value, wrap it up in some plastic and bury it somewhere, like buried treasure, so that these guys can't get at it, even if they have you, at gunpoint, and they're telling me to do these things. And I'm scratching my head thinking, really? I mean, it's that bad? I mean, I had been out in the city, I'd kind of been walking around, and sure, the destruction and everything going on, but my personal sense of what was happening didn't even come close to that level of danger. But then, and again, I'd had the experience of not thinking the typhoon would be so serious either. So should I take these guys seriously? What should I do? I really didn't know. In the end, I did not bury my valuables. I don't even know where I would have buried them anyway, and even if I did, everyone in the hotel would see me do it. So I don't know, they would probably rush out there and dig it up again. I don't know. So I did not do that, but I did make attempts to sort of hide things in my room and make things a little bit more secure based on all these stories I was hearing. And the men in my hotel, interestingly enough, a lot of them were from Tacloban. They weren't tourists. And they'd had this experience with typhoons before, nothing quite as serious, but it was a habit for them when they knew a typhoon was coming, they would move out of their house, like pile all their valuables into their car if they had one, drive to a hotel, park their car, take all their valuables into a hotel room, and they would hunker down there for the duration of the typhoon, because they would be safer there than in their house, because it was one story, it might be low level, it might be close to the ocean, it's going to be flooded, there's nothing they can do to prevent the flood, so they would actually move to a hotel during the typhoon. So a lot of the guys in my hotel were these people, and they moved in with their families and their children. It was really quite a community environment built up there. But in their bags, in their valuable possessions, they also took their guns. And when night started to fall, the very first day, the guns started to come out, and they started loading them and showing them to each other and talking about them. And they made a plan to guard our hotel. It had kind of a courtyard, and I'm listening to them, and again, I'm thinking, really? This is what the world is now, but they're local people. They have a better sense of what's going on than I do. So their plan was to barricade the gate as much as possible that opens into the hotel's courtyard, and then they piled up a whole lot of debris in the courtyard and lit a fire when it got dark. And they took shifts. So throughout the whole night, these men were on patrol around this big bonfire with their guns, defending our hotel from the outside world. So you see that going on, and even calm, cool, collected Bruce Willis / Doug, you gotta start wondering, maybe I should take some of this seriously. And in my mind, I took it to the point of okay, I don't have a gun and I can't exactly do much out there in the courtyard, but maybe I can barricade my room. And I went so far as to do that. I had two beds, took one of the beds and I stripped off the, the mattress and the bedding and everything, and had this big, like really heavy wooden bed frame. And I muscled it into the hallway to the door, where it was the door in my bathroom. And I kind of rigged up the system with the bathroom door and the bed frame, that I managed to jam it against my door, which opens inward. And it was essentially almost a perfect barricade, short of 10 men with a battering ram or a rocket launcher. Nobody was going to be able to force that door open and come into my room. So I did go that far. I'll put in a picture of it right now. I think I took a picture of it. So yeah, for situations like that and COVID-19 pandemic, information is really quite important. And in a way, it's almost worse now because we have social media and I do have internet access, which it's good to have internet and have information, but at the same time, that also is a breeding ground for rumors and panic and horror stories too. So you do have to filter information coming in and make your own judgments of what's true and what isn't, and what kind of preparations you should make. In the middle of all of this, there was one time where I had a good opportunity to get out of Tacloban, and I even tried to take advantage of it. I happened to be walking through the Shoreline community again one day, and I had a nice view of downtown Tacloban and the docks there. So I was out there walking around. I turned around to look at the docks, and to my surprise, there was a giant Filipino naval ship. Gunmetal gray naval ship. I couldn't tell you what kind of ship it was. I took pictures of it later on. I haven't been able to find those pictures. I don't know where they are. If I find them, I'll stick them into the video. But I saw that ship and I became very curious. So on my way back from the Shoreline community, I walked through downtown and I went to the docks where these ships were. And I came up to this big gate. The gate was closed, had a chain around it. There was a barricade and there were some soldiers there, standing there with guns. So I thought, well, that's it. This is as close as I'm going to get to the ship. But as I walked up to the gate and then I started chatting with the soldiers, and they seemed quite friendly, there was no tension in the air or anything like that. I asked them about the ship and they said they were there to bring relief supplies and they were taking away refugees. They were going back to Cebu City. So I asked them, is it okay if I go take a look? And to my surprise, yeah, they opened the gate and said, go on in and take a look around. So, feeling a little bit weird because I don't think I was supposed to be anywhere near this ship, but the soldiers let me in, and then I walked right up to the front of the boat, and it was one of these ships that can carry large vehicles. So it had a big door on the front that would come down, like a ferry, like a naval version of a ferry ship. And the whole thing could come down, and then trucks and tanks or whatever else could drive off the ship. And then the whole interior of the ship was like a wide open flat area. And as I got closer, I could see that this cargo area of the ship, was filled with like mountains of bottled water. Of course, when I saw all that water, the first thing I thought was, I wonder, I wonder if I can have some of that water. I was running low on drinking water, and to take away a few big bottles would be pretty handy. Anyway, I walked up to the front of the ship, and there were more soldiers there, and there was a kind of podium or a desk, and a soldier there with a big ledger in front of him. And I started chatting with him. I told him my story, that I had been in Tacloban when the typhoon hit, and I was there on a touring bicycle. And I'm just sort of feeling this guy out. I keep looking over his shoulder at all this water. To me, it was like a mountain of gold, and I didn't quite know how to broach the topic of, oh, by the way, all that water you have back there, you think I could have some of that? That would really help me out. But it took me a while to get into that. And so I found out from this guy the schedule of the boat, and I asked, could I get on this boat if possible? Like if I wanted to leave Tacloban and go to Cebu, could I get a passage on this boat? And the reason I was asking was because it would have been perfect for my bicycle. I still couldn't ride my bike at this point, but I could load it up with all my gear and just roll it down the streets to the dock, just roll my bike on board the ship, and off we would go to Cebu. It really was the perfect opportunity. If I wanted to get out of Tacloban, this was the way to do it. And the guy was perfectly open to that, and he said, yeah, absolutely, we can take you. And he called over some officers, and these officers came over, and they were talking to me, and they had this ledger there, and I signed up to be evacuated. Wrote down my name and passport number and where I was staying, though that didn't help. But yeah, I gave them all my information. I found out the day they were leaving. It wasn't the next day, but the day after, and I arranged a time. I thought I could come, really early in the day and roll my bike on board. I don't like to do things last minute. I don't like crowded, chaotic situations. So I wanted to get there early and really settle in, and also just to explore the boat. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to take this ship out of Tacloban was what a fun experience it would be, to get a ride on a Filipino naval ship. I thought that would be quite exciting. So yeah, I signed up to be evacuated, and then I finally got around to asking if I could have some water, and they said absolutely, and they gave me a whole case. It was basically as much water as I could carry. I hoisted it onto my shoulder, and it was so heavy. I'd love to have been able to take 2 cases, but I wouldn't have been able to carry that much weight. So I just grabbed the 1 case, and then I carried it back to my hotel. And I was thinking, wow, this is pretty exciting. This was later in my time in Tacloban, so I had kind of experienced a lot of the rebuilding and the recovery. I'd done quite a bit, and it really was an okay time to leave. I really didn't want to leave yet, to be honest, but as I said, this was the perfect opportunity, and I didn't want to pass on it. So, I started going through my gear and kind of doing some pre-packing. I had, 2 days or a day and a half to get ready for the departure, so I didn't have to, fully pack everything. But I was getting ready, and I was thinking ahead to this departure. And then the next day, I thought I would go back to confirm, because you always have to confirm. Even though I'd signed up and my name was in the ledger and everything was settled, I didn't really trust that it was going to happen. Just made sense for me to go back to the dock and go back to the the officers in charge and confirm my passage on this boat. So I walked back to the docks, peeked through the gate, and of course the ship was gone. It had already left. It wasn't supposed to go until the next day. That's what I had been told, and that's what I've been planning on. But I guess plans changed, and the very next day when I went back to confirm, no more boat. It had already left. So that was my one chance to get out of Tacloban with my bicycle, just to roll it on board, and I missed my opportunity. Douglas.
Ate ko na pinakagwapo dito. Ayo. Dito lang kumain kung kuno eh. Dako na ganyan cobra.
Krista mi amor, amor from Dulag.
Ang katalayan at pag sinumatay.
Di mi kalma mi dolor. Magkadura pura yung premisi. Kung padisi, tinimi anamiyagas padisi. E kisira minya uraria, soroto iris. Ni,